let me get started. Okay, so here we are. It's really great to be able to do the boot camp again this year. This is the third year in a row that I've been able to do this one. And it's even more exciting for me because in the past we were somewhat forbidden from doing the low code alternatives. And we really wanted to show you how great that stuff was. And this year the gloves are off. We're able to tell you about Power Automate and other low code solutions. And that's what's going to happen. Okay, so here we are. I have my little bit of a presentation about Power Automate, and then we're going to get to my favorite bit, which is we're going to do a live demo because they always work really well. And then we'll have some time for a bit of Q&A at the end. Now, I was thinking of a theme for my session this time, and for a couple of reasons. One, it's Halloween tomorrow, and two, Halloween is scary but also fun. And I wanted to contrast that with 2020, which is just scary but not so much fun. So here is my themed presentation. Let's see if this works. Oh yeah, I think that went pretty well. Okay. So who is this strange host for the intro to Power Automate? It is I, Jamie McAllister. I've been into Power Automate since the first time I touched it. I thought, what a wonderful product. We had so many false starts with these sort of tools in the Microsoft world. And I just think the whole thing is very well thought through. And that's why I'm very happy to do this presentation today. Now, we always get a mix of skill sets in our boot camp. Some people are absolute beginners and some people are chomping at the bit to do some code. But we're going to start you off, assuming you haven't had so much caffeine at this time in the morning, with the easy session. So this is assuming that you don't have too much knowledge about Power Automate. And then we're going to move on to some later sessions where, well, yes, we really get into it. So this is what we're just going to cover here. We're going to say, what is Power Automate about? What are the components of the flow? We're going to do the demo, and then we'll assess the product and talk about any learning resources where you can push your knowledge further. We'll also do a bit of Q&A, of course. Just to clarify the terminology, because if you talk to anyone in the community or you go to the forums, it's going to be very mixed up. Some people are going to be talking about flow. Some people are going to be talking about Power Automate. The reason for this is the product was actually renamed some time ago. It's part of the so-called Power Platform, where you have Power Apps, Power BI, Power Virtual Agents, etc. And so it was originally called Flow. Lots of us liked the name and we used the name and it was the name of the product, but then they decided, no, let's rebrand it, make it clear that it's part of the Power Platform. So it's now called Power Automate, but what do we create in Power Automate? Power Automate is the platform, but the workflows that we create in Power Automate are called flows. So if you see these terms used interchangeably, worry not. Okay, so what can we do with this thing? I mean, primarily, it's a cloud-based tool which allows us to automate tasks and processes. When we edit our flows, we tend to do that in a browser view, although there is an excellent mobile app where you can also author and kick off flow instances. And there is now actually a client application, which is in preview, but this is really for a new thing which they're pushing out called robotic process automation, which is all about kind of screen scraping forms from legacy systems and things like that, which we're not going to cover today, I have to say. The tool was originally pushed out there as a personal productivity tool, a little bit like Zapier. They were talking about citizen development. But I have to say, it's become so popular because of its utility that it's not just non-devs using Power Automate these days. There are actually plenty of devs incorporating flows into their solutions too. So it really is a wonderful glue between all the different applications we use. And I'm talking about Microsoft applications, certainly. It's very good within Office 365, but it's also fantastic to pull in all those other cloud services. You know, maybe you want to write some files to your Dropbox, for example. Maybe you want to do something with Trello. You know, there's connectors for all these things, and you can work with them. Okay, what are the components of a flow? Well, I mean, this is certainly something that we'll be covering in detail in our demo, but at the end of the day, a flow always starts with a trigger. So there will be some sort of trigger. Now we can schedule them. We could say run this flow every minute, every hour, every day, every week. We can start them manually. So it's possible to have buttons on mobile applications which start a flow. It's even possible to have physical buttons. I have a button called a flick button. You can put that somewhere and you can press it and it communicates with the cloud and it starts a flow. And we can also start a flow because of an event. So for example, if a document is put into a SharePoint library, a flow may begin on that and begin some sort of process. After the trigger, of course, we have actions. So there are things we can do. We can send emails, we can write files, we can change metadata, etc., etc. We have connections to these other systems and these other resources, be they in the Microsoft world or be they outside the Microsoft world. And of course, we're also able to have some conditional logic, which we'll talk about in a little while. The number of connectors goes up all the time. The number of connectors now is 300 plus. That means it's gone up by about 50% in just the last 2 years. So really, if there is a cloud-based service somewhere that you want to interact with, you have a very good chance of being able to find an existing connector to do that. And in fact, if you don't have an existing connector, you are able to create your own. And we're going to be covering that a little later on today. Some of these connectors are generally available, as in your free out-of-the-box version of Flow can actually utilize them. Some of them are premium. So one, you may need a premium subscription on the Power Automate side, but of course, then you may also have to pay for some of these services at the vendor side. Another great thing about this stuff is that we have a lot of pre-built templates. Now, Microsoft and the community have been writing flows for a few years now. And if it was something particularly useful and also reusable, then those flows have been saved as templates and they're actually available on the site. So instead of writing something from scratch, you can look down the long list of templates. And if you see something which mostly meets your needs, then you can click on the template, create it. You may have to fill in some new credentials for the different connections to different services. And maybe you need to tweak it a little bit to exactly match your needs, but it can save you a lot of work. It's also possible to save your own content. So if you have a flow which you need to share with someone or you want to post to the community, you can export that as a file, and it's a form of zip file, which you can share with people and they can import into their environment. And you can also submit your flows as a template so that they can be considered for inclusion in the community. Talking about triggers then, so these are the things that start off a flow. Once again, as we said, you can have even physical reasons that a flow kicks off. I once wrote a flow, for example, where you would have a flow button stuck to the dashboard of your car. And if you were going to be late home from work, you would click that button, it would kick off a flow, it would determine from your phone where you were, and then it would send an email to your loved ones saying, I'm going to be late, I'm currently here, and my estimated time of arrival is this, based on some traffic information web service, which I was able to call. So these are the sort of things you can do. Plus, of course, as we mentioned before, if we're putting content into SharePoint, OneDrive, other places, then these connectors are trigger as well as scheduling. And flows work very well with Power Apps, which I dare say we'll probably be looking at later too. There's a very wide range of actions available because if you think about it, all these connections that we have, it's not just the Office 365 stuff. all these different products which we're able to connect to, they all have associated actions. There are always things that you can do with them. In the Office 365 world, it's very easy. We can be creating documents, we can be sending notifications, we can be moving content from one place to another, etc., etc. And once again, there are different types of connectors: standard, premium, custom, etc. We need a little bit of control when we're going through any electronic process. It's not just a straight line from here to there. Like, there has to be some sort of conditional logic. So we have the equivalent of if statements. We can do and or expressions in those things. We can have loops so that we go through large data sets. This is an apply to each. We can do a do until, which is going to sound very familiar to you if you've got any sort of coding background. We can also do switches, for which I'd say the same thing. So switches can help you limit the number of if statements by simply having a list of different cases which might match to say, is the value 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Then you can just have a switch statement with those listed and the actions that you would take. We can bring the things that we're doing in a flow together within a scope. So this is helping us encapsulate a block of actions, and that can also help us do some error handling. And then there's a control called terminate. If you get to a point in the flow where you have to stop it for whatever reason, then you can put a terminate control in there. I have to say, right, stop now. A word about data flow then. Effectively, when we have one of these processes, the data flow comes from the top. So any data which you are obtaining near the start of the process will be available to you later on in the process. So if you're going to have some steps later on in the flow which need some information about a particular file, you will have always got the details of the file, like you will have run an action to say, give me the file properties before that. And then you have a very nice picker. Whenever you have a field where you need to put some information into the flow, you have a very nice picker that appears on the right of the screen, allowing dynamic content. And this is proactively suggesting what it thinks is the most likely value that you're going to want based on the information that you've already obtained in your flow. So this is once again very powerful. Now, if this doesn't have data that you need, then we also have expressions. So this is an Excel-like syntax if you've ever written expressions in an Excel sheet. And this allows you to do a little bit more than that dynamic content could do. So we have a number of functions in here, and these are grouped. So you have string functions, collections, you have mathematical functions, logical functions, string functions, etc. And so you can really get to the data that you need. For example, maybe you need the middle of a particular string, or you need to replace a value in a string and that sort of thing. You're going to find ways to do that with expressions, and you don't have to type them out necessarily. There is a picker, as you kind of see on the screen here, where you can actually build it in an expression builder. Now, in terms of error handling, it is possible to do it because, as mentioned, these scopes, they have some settings on there so that you can say if it's successful, go to the next action, this sort of thing. But you can also say if it's failed, if the scope is skipped, if the actions inside there are timed out, then also do something. So effectively, you can put some pretty good error handling in here. You can effectively do the sort of try, catch, finally, which you may have seen in C# and other languages. So this is always good to do. Now, when I do these flow demos for simplicity, we don't tend to put these things in because it is more complicated. But anything that you're using in anger, in production, of course, you're going to take these extra steps to make sure that you work in these things to make it production ready. Also, since SharePoint is my specialism for many years, I would be remiss not to say that SharePoint and Power Automate work together very well. There are actually several flows which have already been created, which are baked into SharePoint out of the box, SharePoint Online this is. So one of the things to say about that is, you have approval workflows, built in. You can request sign off. You can have reminders. You can easily create reminders based on a date field. So you could say, 2 days before the due date, send me an email, this sort of thing. So this is pretty good. Also, one quite nice feature is in SharePoint, we have something called conditional formatting. And this allows you to change the look and feel of cells within a SharePoint list or library. And one of the ways that you can change it is to actually allow that conditional formatting to surface a button where you can initiate a flow. So if an item reached a certain status where it was relevant to run some electronic process, then the button can be right there next to the process. So for example, if it was status complete or status ready, then you might show that as a flow button, ready to press the button. It just saves the user a few mouse clicks. So what can you do with this stuff? I mean, honestly, the sky's the limit. I mean, approval workflows is one of the first things that people spoke about, but people are doing actions for personal productivity. Maybe they're storing their email attachments to their OneDrive for Business account so that they can have a copy of that later without wading through their inbox. They are notifying each other of upcoming tasks and priorities. Maybe they are receiving emails, and any emails which have the word urgent in the subject line are being flagged for follow-up. These are all things which are possible. And one of my favorite things is we now have a lot of intelligence services available in the cloud from Microsoft and other vendors, and we're able to very easily integrate those into Power Automate. So you can actually bring the benefits of machine learning. You don't have to be some data scientist to be able to use this stuff. It's really very accessible indeed. And this is one of the things we're going to look at today. And so, without further ado, my favorite bit, let's have a look at a bit of a demo. Now, let me explain the scenario. Like I said, this is all a little bit Halloween themed today. And so I had a bit of an idea for the content. From a real incident, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, I was talking to a user in business, and they were saying that they were receiving a bunch of untagged content, like images with text in it, etc., from a vendor. They didn't have any metadata associated with that. It was just being uploaded straight. And he just threw up his hands and he said, there's clearly nothing we can do about this. This content is unusable. I said, well, that's not necessarily true. We actually have a lot of capabilities now using a bit of machine intelligence. We can actually recognize this content and we can actually tag it. So if we just have a little bit of a look at some content I've put together for today, we have, well, a bunch of stuff. Most of it is Halloween themed, except one item, which I'm going to talk about, the cultural bias of machine intelligence a little bit. So let's have a little bit of a look at some of this stuff, high level. So we have screenshots of textual content. It would be really nice if this opened, wouldn't it? There you go. It was just thinking about it. Okay, so we have some screenshots of textual content. So this is kind of copying what this business user was so concerned about a few years ago, that they were getting this sort of thing and the computer couldn't make any sense of it. So here we have a poem around Halloween by Robbie Burns. And then we have some candy images because, trick or treat. We have the Gettysburg Address, not because it's Halloween based, but I want to make a point about this a little later on. And then we have, some happy children, which is always good to see. Jack-o'-lanterns and spiders, witches' hats. This is a little bit of a curveball for the AI. This sounds like a pretty happy poem, The Emperor of Ice Cream, but it's actually really not a happy poem. I want to see what the AI makes of this one. The Raven, that classic poem of Halloween. And then I rather like this image. I don't know about you. When I first saw this image, I was like, beer. Somehow you just don't see the skull and crossbones on the top, but I guess that's the problem with this stuff. I want to see what the AI makes of this too. Okay, so we've got this content. This is going to go into SharePoint. And basically, I want to know how scary it is. I want the AI to tell me how scary it is. And we're going to write a flow to achieve this. Okay, so let's run on over to SharePoint and see what we've got. So a bunch of that content has been added here within a document library. So as you can see, it's just kind of sat in there and we don't know anything about it right now. We've got the poetry, we've got the stock images of Halloween, all good. Okay, fantastic. But this doesn't really tell us anything, does it? Now, the first thing you might do is you might go into Power Automate and you might create a flow which was going to find out what was in this content and then start to categorize it. Now, if this was a couple of years ago, I would have said, yep, that's what you've got to do. Use cognitive services to discover what this information is all about. However, one thing that I really like about the direction of Microsoft products right now is that they're baking machine intelligence into all their products across the range all the time. And this is one of the things that they've actually done with SharePoint. So already, if I was to just change this default view, what we're going to do is see what other columns are in here, because it turns out that extracted text and tags are two hidden out of the box columns, which are getting filled in behind the scenes without your knowledge. Now, I haven't implemented anything for this to happen. This is happening in SharePoint by default. So it's knowing that if you have a screenshot of some text, it's actually doing some OCR on the text, which is going to help the search crawler find that relevant content. And similarly, if you have images, it's actually doing some recognition there, and then it's coming up with descriptive tags of what may be in the image, once again, to aid the search experience. Now, I have to say, going through these tags, I actually find them pretty high quality. I mean, you know, you've got the group of girls in Halloween costumes. I mean, it's mentioning trick or treat, evil, wig, happy, but it's even got October in there because it realizes that it's a Halloween scene. And of course, Halloween happens in October, and maybe you're searching for that sort of context. So it's been filled into the tags. So this is brilliant. You're getting this for free out of the box just by using SharePoint. So no flow required to actually come up with the description of this content, which might have been pretty impenetrable just a couple of years ago. So this is the first thing. This is great.
Jamie?
Yes.
You have a few questions. I don't know if you want to answer now or at the end of the session.
Let's do them at the end. I think that'd be best.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so yeah, we have this content and we want to know how scary it is. So how are we going to do that? Well, I've added a couple more columns to this library. These are my columns just for demo purposes. So if we just go here, I have created a choice column called inclusion. This is the thing which is going to kick off our automatic process. And I have another thing called scariness, which is going to be the rating of how scary the content is. We'll see if it's suitable for inclusion in our Halloween celebrations. So we just show these two. Right. So anything that gets added to the library is just going to be new inclusion status by default. And if I approve it, then it's going to kick off an electronic process to give it some sort of rating. And then we're going to get the scariness factor written here. Okay, so let's do that. Let's change the rating of the Burns poem, for example, and then I have a pre-written process which is going to run, but we're also going to write the same process again to show you how this is all done. So we'd say approved. That's saved, great. So I should have some sort of process running in the background now to give me a scariness factor. Let's not just do it with text, let's also do it with, you know, for example, the group of girls. There we go. In fact, heck, let's do it for a few of these things. We better show that the machine can do its work. we go. Okay, so we've got a little bit of the process buzzing away in the background now. Just in case you were wondering as well, I'm just going to upload that beer graphic. And I think I haven't uploaded the Gettysburg graphic. I want to do those guys too, because they make a valid point. Aha! Now you see this, we have actually got some scariness factors coming through already. So actually it's the opposite way around. This is a value that's coming back from the AI. It's a value between 0 and 1. 0 would be the most negative possible rating, and 1 would be the absolute maximum positive rating. So we actually see that because the Robert Burns poem about fairies and light and things like that, although it's titled Halloween, it's not actually negative at all, and therefore we got a pretty low scariness factor, although it's looking high on the number here. Also, you know, the lovely candy is looking very positive. So we've got this sort of thing happening here. But then we have the jack-o'-lanterns. Now, the association with the jack-o'-lanterns was all this kind of thing about evil, devil, trick, etc. And we can see we've actually got it's actually pretty scary because it's quite a low number. So this is the sort of thing we can get to here. Notice as well, I did drag the alcohol picture on here a few seconds ago. So it took a few seconds, but then we did get some tags based on that one here. So we've got the thing saying, yeah, you know, drunk driving. Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's pretty negative stuff. Okay, so we know that this is working. Wouldn't it be nice if we knew how it was working? So let's jump into a bit of a demo, shall we? So let me just get my environment. Okay, so this is the flow which was just running, the scary factor flow, which was supplying those numbers just now. So I'm just going to turn this off because actually we're going to create a new one to see how this is all done. So let's create a new flow. Now there's lots of ways, as promised, that you can create a flow from template, from Visio templates, automated, which means from some sort of event that's happening, instant, which means that we kick it off in some way, scheduled, it being on a timer, and then we have these things called UI flows, etc., which are these kind of new capabilities to effectively automate processes on the UI and also screen scrape and that sort of thing. We want automated because we want this to happen when something happens in SharePoint, i.e. we change that column to say, yes, process this thing. Okay, so let's call this scary tagger because I never could come up with good names for stuff. And then our trigger is going to be SharePoint related. So it's always good to put that in. By the way, there are so many triggers and actions and things like that now. You're going to find yourself using this search button at the search box all the time to find your stuff, because scrolling down lists forever is just painful. Now, there's a very specific trigger I need for this one, because to cut a long story short, I want to see what's changed in terms of the columns, as in that inclusion property. And to do that one, I very specifically, I have to choose this new trigger, which was released during the last few months. When an item or a file is modified in SharePoint, if I choose a different trigger, it's not going to work, just in case you ever run into that issue. Okay, so we create. Okay, so this is my trigger. It wants to know, well, what site and what library is this all about? So I have to choose the site. I have to choose one of the libraries in the site. Notice it's being intelligent here. You know, it's looking at what's in the site, and there's only one library in there right now, which is documents. So this is my trigger already complete. And then I want to get some information. Next step. And once again, this is SharePoint. And I am going to say, get changes when an item or a file, properties only, which is what I want. So this is going to tell me when the properties of this file have changed. It's going to get those changes. So once again, unfortunately, I still have to put in this. Now, when I click here, notice what I promised here in terms of the dynamic content. It's offering me information from the first stage proactively. And I can see here in gray which of the previous stages this information has been obtained from that first trigger. So this is the ID of the item. Now, when you do this thing, when you're looking for the changes of specific attributes in a list in SharePoint, it's asking for this thing since, and you can put in version numbers and various other things in here. But if you don't really have anything to say about this, you can just say trigger window start token. I don't expect you to remember the name of this. This is just what Microsoft called it. It's a new thing that they created specifically for this use case. This is where I'm looking to see if the inclusion property has changed. So there we go. We put that in there, and the end property there. So once again, this is now configured. So it's going to give me the information of what has changed. Now, just coming along here for later purposes, I'm just going to have a variable which I'm going to fill in. So I'm going to create a variable, initialize variable. Now, this is going to be my sentiment score, which will later be converted to a scariness factor. And this is going to be of type float because it's a number between 0 and 1. And it's not going to have an initial value. Okay, time to make some decisions. So I'm going to add a new step now, and I'm effectively going to have one of those if conditions. Now, actually, condition is showing up here already by default, because it's one of the most popular things you're going to choose. So the value is going to be has column. Now, this is this thing that was released recently. It's because this is coming from these get changes for an item or file, properties only. We're asking, has the property changed? And we only want to run the rest of the flow if the inclusion property has changed. So has changed is equal to, and then we need to put true. But be careful here, we don't just type true, we have to kind of do it as an expression. So we do true like that. It will recognize that. If I just put in true as a string, I might have trouble. But I don't just want to know if the property has changed. I also need to make sure that it's been changed to, approved for the running of this flow, not rejected or something like that. So I'm going to add a second part of the condition, which is going to be the inclusion. This is it again. You have to do search. Inclusion, and it's actually the inclusion value. It's the value that I need to look at. So there we go. Inclusion is equal to approved, which is just a string. And this is an and. I mean, I could make this an or, but that wouldn't be suitable for what we want to do today. I need to make sure it's changed to kick off the flow, but also that it's approved. So that's good. If we don't meet these conditions, then we don't want to do anything more here. So we're just going to do a terminate like this. But let's not say failed because it's going to show up as failed in our history. So we're going to say succeeded, but no further action. If, however, we are ready to do a bit more, then we're going to go into yes. So this is our branch. So let's add an action. I'm going to create a scope here, which we were mentioning before, just to group some of this stuff together. And so in here, I'm going to add a condition. but let me tell you why I'm going to add a condition. I noticed that when we're looking at the extracted text and the extracted tags, if it is some of the screenshot-like text, which we saw before, it tends to have a tag, not descriptive like the images, but it's something like text screenshot. So I want to make sure that I look at this, define the sentiment of this in a slightly different way to the other one. So I'm going to make a decision based on that. So I'm going to do an if condition again. And this is to say that if that tags field, which we were just looking at in SharePoint, does not contain the word text, then we're pretty fair to assume that it's actually one of the photos, one of the images, whereas if it does contain that, then it's one of the screenshots of text, and we're going to handle it a slightly different way. Okay? So what are we going to do? We're going to now finally do this detect sentiment thing. So we're going to use a service here. It's one of the cognitive services that Microsoft provides. This is called Text Analytics, and this allows us to do a detect sentiment. Now, I did say in the intro to this session that these things you're able to do for free. Now, your flow, you're definitely going to have this included, and hopefully along with SharePoint, if you're using Office 365 at work. Some of these cognitive services you can also sign up for in Azure, and depending on the subscription, it's actually free for some of them. Like it might limit you to very few runs of that cloud service per month. Maybe you'll get 1,000 a month or something, but it's very good for development and learning purposes like this. In any event, you can always sign up for these services 30 days for free, and you get like a $200 Azure credit to use. So this is why I say you can copy this, you can do this for free. Okay, so back to this, we're going to detect sentiment on an item. So it wants to know, well, what document is it detecting sentiment on, as in, what row in the list? So here we need to find that ID column again. There we go. This is the unique ID of the list item in SharePoint. Then it's going to say, well, what text from that do you actually want to analyze? We know that this is the image branch that we've decided, so this is going to be about the tags. And the other thing is, you can optionally specify the language. I know for this demo purposes, this is all in English, so that's fine. And that's it. So this is going to generate a sentiment score, and then I'm just going to set that variable, which I defined before to hold the score, set variable. The only variable available is sentiment score, and the value is going to be the score coming from this cognitive service here, score. Now there's only one value, and I don't know why, but okay. If you're ever iterating through a collection, Flow will also automatically put in one of these apply to each so that you can iterate through every item. Now, this score, which I get from cognitive services, is only one single value, but somehow the Flow is thinking, oh, this is multiple items and it does this. Don't worry about it. It will only run once, but it is a little bit confusing the first time you do this. Okay, anyway, so I've got my sentiment score for the photos. Now I need to do it for the text as well. Same sort of thing. I'm going to use the cognitive service for sentiment, text analytics, detect sentiment, and this is going to seem like second nature now because we just did it. We've got the ID. We don't have the tags that are very rich for the screenshot stuff, but we do have the extracted text field, which is like the OCR, which SharePoint automatically did. Once again, set the language to English, and once again, set the variable to the sentiment score, which we just got. Okay, cool. So that's all within a scope. And then outside that scope, I'm just going to write that value, update file properties, to the file which kicked off this whole process because its status was changed. And once again, we do the usual stuff here. What are we writing? Wait a minute, ID. Let's set, so the inclusion value, the reason the flow will have got to this point is because the inclusion value will be approved. Let's say now it's complete because we're writing a score to it. And the scariness factor here is going to be the sentiment score from the variable there. So that's it. That is the flow done. Let's save that one. And hopefully we're in business. So let's go back to here. This is on, and we seem to be in good shape. I'm going to turn off, I'm doing this off screen, sorry. I've just turned off the other flow which I had, which did the scariness factor assessments here, so that we can see that our new thing works. So let us refresh our screen in SharePoint, because I'm sure Gettysburg has now had some changes to it. There we go. It's got its text. So let us effectively kick off our new flow by changing our field, our inclusion field, to be approved. There we go. So that's working away in the background. Let's do it for the Halloween hat because that's not done yet. Nice. And finally, I think let's do the beer because that's an interesting one. And not just because of the taste. Okay, so this is all running in the background now. So I should have several flow instances running in the background. One thing to say, of course, is flow is asynchronous. So you can never guarantee that it's going to run that second. There may always be a delay. You have to factor that into whatever business process you're automating. Okay, so that's all running in the background. Now, one of the things that you can see for a flow is its run history. So this is the one that we just wrote. If we go into the run history, hey, great, we haven't had any failures, so I must have written it right. Now, this is important. Sometimes if you're just writing a flow, certainly during the process of writing a flow, you're going to have to come into the run history pretty often. And if you have any failures, it's especially important that you know about this screen, because if you click into the run history, you're going to see exactly what happened with the flow, but you can actually click into the actions and you can see all the data about what was happening. So if you get any failures, it's very good to go into here for debugging. And I run into a lot of people who are just starting with Power Automate and they just don't know about being able to go in here and seeing exactly what path. We can see the ticks, as in we know in which direction the process went. It didn't go down this branch, we got across there, it went down this branch. And we can see, for example, exactly what sentiment score, it went down this branch for this one. We can see exactly what sentiment score was derived and on what text. So this is very useful. And so we have multiple flow runs here, and after that, hey, they've all succeeded. Doesn't always happen, I can tell you. So let's just do a refresh. And I have to say, that's looking pretty good. Now there's some interesting stuff here. Notice here the Raven, the Edgar Allan Poe poem, is seen as very low score, very scary, effectively. The alcoholism thing, I mean, terrible tags. I mean, I'm not sure I ever want a beer again when I read this. Also, I mean, it's the lowest score on here. It's pretty incredible. And the Emperor of Ice Cream, which I said was a curveball for the AI, because it's actually a very nasty poem, but sounds nice, got a really low score as well. So I don't know how the AI worked that out, but that's a pretty good result. It's pretty impressive. etc. Now there is one thing here. Yeah. So look at the Gettysburg Address. Now the Gettysburg Address, as you may know, is this speech by Lincoln when he dedicated the cemetery at Gettysburg. And, you know, it's all about kind of liberty and things like that. And this gets a near perfect sentiment score, as in the happiest score, of nearly 1. Now, the reason I wanted to mention this is it seems very strange that this would get an almost perfect score. And I can only say that maybe some values from the culture that wrote this technology have been inculcated into the AI model when it was being trained. And I'm just throwing that out there to say, be careful of AI because it is subject to cultural bias. And this is a very strange result. Okay, so we have these scores here. I think we can agree that the flow works. It's doing the sentiment scoring properly, but I don't really like my scariness index here. I mean, it looks unconvincing because actually the high number is happy, not the low number. So I'm just going to change the way that this looks. So if I just go into my library settings, like so, we're just going to go into that scariness column, and I'm just going to introduce a little bit of conditional formatting. And this is going to change the way that column looks based on the values. And so now, if the scariness is low, then we have a low arrow down in the green. But if the scariness is high, like the jack-o'-lanterns and especially like the drinking, ouch, then we have a high needle into the red. So we've got the maximum scariness being clearly shown. So there we go. This is how we determine the scariness of content using flow and AI capabilities. Now, I do have a few more slides which we can fall back to if we have time, but I realize time's ticking on. So if you want to do a few questions now, we can do that and also wrap up. My slides will be available for download after this.
So I'm telling you the questions that pop up before. So we have Max that asked, for example, if there is a central repository where you can store flows or hand over to other people. So what are the options? Is something?
It's a very good question. Yeah, it's a very good question because initially, when you get started with Flow, you might be using the free offering with Office 365 and that sort of thing. And it's really, when you start off like that, it's just for the individual. So you have access to your flows. And like I said, you can actually save them as templates and you can share them with people. But in a production and a serious environment, say this is not just being used for your personal productivity, but it's actually a solution for the whole department, that's not good. But if you upgrade to a premium subscription of Power Automate, which is actually not so much money a month, then you start getting into the situation where you can share your repositories with other premium users within your organization, and therefore you can actually do some proper dev, and have shared access to your solutions and that sort of thing. So that would be probably the best way to do it. Plus, of course, then you get access to those premium connectors and other features as well. You actually get more flow runs available to you per month and stuff like that if you have the premium subscription. Now, I have to say most people can get by on the default, but not everyone. So yeah, that's the way to go with that one.
Awesome. So you added some more context. I already answered the question, so it's good. Thank you very much for that. Let's go to the next one, still from Max. And Max was asking, how do I run flows on a non-personal account? I think he means, how do I ensure that a flow is not run with the account that was creating the flow?
That kind of depends. That kind of depends how it's kicked off. I mean, if you're initiating a flow, then it's going to run under your identity. But I mean, I have seen the case where maybe Microsoft would frown on this, but I have seen the case where Flow premium accounts have been set up with a kind of generic account, like a machine account, which no one really has access to. And when that runs from an automated trigger, as in some content has been added to a SharePoint library, that is actually running under the identity of that premium account, not the person who added the content to the library. So those are the different way it works. But if you instantiate a flow, it's definitely going to be running under your account, if you see what I mean. But yeah, flows can be authored in fairly generic accounts and run that way too. There is also an offering. If you look at the licensing page for Power Automate, they also have these things where you have dedicated standalone Power Automate subscriptions for running dedicated flows. But that's actually quite expensive, and I think that's really pitched towards flows which are meeting, enterprise needs. I don't want to talk too much about this, but when Flow was first introduced, like I say, I mean, it was really pitched for the citizen developer, and it would never replace Nintex and things like that. But now, to be honest, the mood music is changing, and I think there are some instances where they would see it as a rival to some of those other major enterprise workflow products.
Awesome, thank you. I'm just telling you the question. I don't have more context. Let's see if we can figure out what he means. Still, Max is asking, where do you see the limits and switch to normal coding?
That's a really good question. So as Max clearly appreciates, when you have code-free solutions like this, there is this concept which I like to call the wall, where you find getting results is harder and harder as you approach the wall. And in traditional coding, you would be able to write something to get around that. But with the code-free solution, you're doing all these if statements and switches and this sort of thing, just to try and get fairly basic results, because you're reaching that wall, that limitation of what the no-code solution does. But I have to say, with something like Power Automate, this is slightly less of a concern. You see, Power Automate has been designed to be able to utilize all these web services, REST APIs, webhooks, all this good stuff. Now, you can write custom connectors to connect to services which aren't in the standard thing. You could actually write connectors to your own services. So if there is something which you can't achieve, you can actually fall back to code. Maybe you're writing some web functions or something like that. Some Azure functions, this sort of thing, elsewhere. So you can actually fall back to code. And then with a custom connector, you can actually be calling that stuff from your flow. So you are not boxed in. It's not like in the past where the no-code solution only had its own ecosystem to work with. Power Automate has been designed so really the whole of the cloud, and even some of your on-premises data, because we have a thing called the data gateway, is available to you. So you may have to fall back to code, but not within Flow itself, and a flow can utilize that code.
Awesome, thank you. I don't see any more questions. Emanuele, do you? I think we are through with the questions.
No.
Awesome. So if you want to wrap up and continue with your presentations, all questions have been answered.
Okay, super. I mean, we could look at the presentation. I know presentations are not the best. Let's just whiz through the last ones, and then I give the podium to someone else. Okay, so just to say then, a few last slides. As mentioned just now, there is such a thing as the data gateway. So although we might write flows that primarily interact with cloud services, it is possible to install a product called the on-premises data gateway to some relevant servers in your organization. And this allows communication with your on-premises data and your Power Platform solutions. Now, I have to say, I haven't installed one of these things for a couple of years. I'm not sure how much this has changed, but it was a little bit finicky with firewalls and things like that, but it was entirely possible to provision this data gateway and have these cloud processes interact with our on-premises data. Flows will never run within your on-premises. Microsoft have clearly stated, the Power Platform is never going to be retooled so that it could be installed on your local servers within the organization, but it's not that interaction is not possible. It will always be a cloud tool, but your on-premises data, if you choose, is not off limits. There's also a thing called the Common Data Service, which I didn't really mention today. This is becoming increasingly important. I mean, it underlines various products like Dynamics. It's very important with Power Apps. It's more and more important with Flow, etc. And this allows you to kind of create relational data and various entities and relationships which your apps can thrive on. It's also allowing now certain things like AI Builder, so we can actually train our own AI models, and through having CDS, we are able to interact with those with our apps too. Also, as mentioned, custom connectors. There's going to be a session on this, so I don't want to say too much, but if there isn't a connector right now for Power Automate, then you can make sure that there is one. What's good about Power Automate? I mean, it's so simple and easy to use, and I really feel like they thought through the use cases really carefully. So honestly, from the first moment that I touched the tool, it was like a sigh of relief. You know, we had a lot of false starts with this sort of product in the Microsoft world, and I was getting tired as an IT professional of trying to polish some of the junk that we were being shipped. But with the Power Platform and some of the new capabilities in SharePoint, I can hold my head up high and say, this stuff is worth it to the business. What's not so good about it? I mean, there's been a bit of a complaint about state machine workflows not being explicitly supported, but there are actually patterns that you can introduce. If you check out Serge Luca's blog, there are patterns that you can introduce to achieve the same sort of result. Expressions are pretty good, but they can be a little bit finicky sometimes. I sometimes find the editing environment, because it's browser-based, sometimes a little bit flaky. Sometimes it tells you your expression is invalid, even though it isn't, and you have to kind of click OK and pretend to make an edit, and then OK again, and then it accepts it. You know, this sort of thing. There is also a long-running complaint about the flow run period being a maximum of 30 days. So if it was kind of waiting, if a flow instance was running and it was polling for information, the maximum that's going to be able to wait is 30 days. Now, I did hear a story that this was going to be extended, but then I also have to say that I rechecked the limitations website for this product just yesterday, and it still stated 30 days, so I don't know what's going on there. As mentioned with Max's question, yeah, flows do tend to run under the context of the current user, but not in all cases, as mentioned. And if you want to make a flow instance production ready, building in all the error management and, you know, getting ready for all the different cases which might occur, then you do have to be careful. It can be a little bit of a pain to build that all into your thing, but that would be true with any tool, I guess. If you would like to go further, there are a lot of learning resources here which you can get your hands on. I have to say the Power Automate site has got a lot of resources, so you can go from zero to hero in a very short time. And, you know, let me plug my video channel on YouTube, because, well, it takes time to make those videos. And two, you know, I've solved a few problems which people were asking for solutions for. I have to give a bit of kudos to the Houston Power Apps and Flow user group, because some of the slides I used here were adapted from their slides, although their stuff still called everything Flow, so it was definitely a bit out of date. And finally, if you enjoyed the session, or even if you didn't, the QR code here or the link below gives you access to a survey, so you can let Microsoft know how you find the global Microsoft 365 Developer Bootcamp. Needless to say, all those guys running the bootcamp today are volunteers. We're not really affiliated with Microsoft. Certainly, I don't work for Microsoft, and I never have. We're just enthusiastic about technology, and that's why we're doing this today. So, if you want to know, if you want to let Microsoft know how you find these events, feel free to fill out that survey. And that's it from me.